Hello, everyone. I'm Mabel Chan. Welcome to a brand new season of my podcast, One in a Billion. Today, we kick off a special series, Find Your Roots. Find Your Roots is about Asian American mothers, daughters, fathers, and sons looking back at the roots of their family history, cultural identity, and personal journey, one person at a time.
My name is Elaine Shiang. 我叫向文义. Je m'appelle Elaine Shiang. I was born in the year of the tiger, 1950, in Malden, Massachusetts. Am I a boomer? Absolutely.
Elaine is a retired doctor specializing in internal medicine. She went to Wellesley College, graduated from Harvard Medical School, and did all her postgraduate training in the Boston area.
I grew up mostly in Massachusetts, and it was far away from where my parents grew up, which was Hunan, China for my father, and Qingdao for my mother.
In this episode, Elaine talks about her upbringing, her parents' influence, and how they've shaped her character and choices in life. Elaine also opens up about her parenting style with her 3 children, all grown up now. What are some of the generational or cultural differences in their values and communication styles? How do they shift and reshape their relationships over time? Here's our conversation. Dr. Elaine Shiang, you were born in Malden, the greater Boston area. So at what point in your life did you become curious about your roots in China? Early childhood, teenage years, or later?
I always knew that we as a family were a little bit different from other families, only because I had to go to Chinese school on Saturday, and nobody else did.
So what age was that when you started going to Chinese school?
I was probably in 1st or 2nd grade.
So you didn't rebel?
Age 6 or 7, you can't rebel very much.
Oh, that's right. I see. You're not exposed enough to other teachings that will derail you.
Right. And I was always curious as a child, wow, learning something different, having a recess where you could play basketball and climb the ropes, and eating Chinese food, just a great experience for me.
You mentioned your roots in China. Where are those roots?
My father came from Hunan province, which many people know is where Mao Zedong came from. And my mother always used to say he has Hunan Piqi, which means he's got the personality from Hunan, which means stubborn and likes hot food. My mother is from Qingdao, China, in Shandong province. And Shandong province has a history of being colonized by the Germans, by the Japanese. Because of those foreign influences, there were many international people in Qingdao. And my mother had the opportunity to learn piano, and she had Catholic school upbringing in English. She had French and German and American nuns teach her. Her father was a true international businessman.
So did you see any parts of those elements of her personality and character in yourself at any point in your life?
Absolutely. And that's because I've been to Qingdao to visit cousins there, who are the daughters and sons of my mother's older sister. And they used to tell me stories. My mother was described as smarter and the quicker one because she always used to run away if they were going to get spanked.
Right. She knows how to escape.
She knew how to escape.
And did you pick that up too?
According to my older sister, I always escaped when there was something hard to do.
Oh.
Like babysit my 3 brothers.
That's funny. Now, on your father's side, tell me how you see yourself in those roots.
Well, my father's roots are a little harder to dig up. I do know that my father was sent to boarding school when he was young, and he was a very serious student because a lot of people knew him and remembered him. And I think part of my seriousness is understanding that to get somewhere, you really have to learn things. And I think he did that for me. He also believed in us as girls, my sister and myself. He would teach us shortcuts in math. He would teach us about the stock market, the Red Sox, and how to analyze statistics from Red Sox batting averages. My father also, he had a compassionate side. He would say, the purpose in life is to help others.
Can you tell me more about your name in Chinese?
Yes, well, Wen is culture. My Chinese is not great, but our family lived in Taiwan when I was 12 and left when I was 14. And my father was working with the China Petroleum Company. And I remember meeting the CEO of that company at the time. And he named us 5 siblings after the 5 Confucian virtues. So the Wen was the name that each of us had, and then the 5 virtues, starting with Ren, which is benevolence for my sister, and going all the way down Ren Yi, Li, Zhi, Xing. The 5 of us got our names. And I think that was perfect for my father, who liked to be cultured, perfect for us kids because it kept us grounded.
Have you gone back to your hometowns, home villages in China, and try to sort of trace your roots, whatever that means for you?
Yes, I have been to China many times, and in particular, I've been to my mother's hometown of Qingdao. Uh, my father, he's a reticent fellow. He never really talked about where he came from. I'm not sure I even understand at this time why that is. But my mother grew up in a fairly wealthy household. And that's because my grandfather, he was in the harbor in Qingdao, where he discovered a black bag on the quay, the most famous quay in Qingdao, going out into the harbor. The black bag had thousands of German marks in it.
Wow.
He didn't know who it belonged to. There was nobody else on the quay. So he decided to sleep there overnight and safeguard the bag.
Wow, instead of taking it home.
He did not take it home. He had been schooled by Christian missionaries, or whatever the Confucian ideals were. He felt that he had to return this bag. But nobody came the first day. The next night, a Caucasian man named Mr. Zimmerman came by. And he asked my grandfather, "Have you seen a black bag?" And my grandfather asked him, "What does this black bag look like?" And it was hidden under his coat. And he brought it out after Mr. Zimmerman described it. And Mr. Zimmerman said, "My gosh, you are so honest.
Whoa.
And will you be one of my business partners?"
Amazing. That's truly incredible. It's like a miracle.
Well, it was a miracle design. So my grandfather became his business partner. They founded 3 manufacturing companies, and then my grandfather became fairly wealthy and bought a lot of real estate in the Qingdao area.
Wow, what an amazing story. Let me dig some more with you about other interesting aspects of your visit. What were you most eager to discover?
Just wanted to see where my mother grew up, to see what the influences on her life were. Because once she had moved from Chicago to Boston, Chicago's where my parents were married, and then they settled in the Boston area, they could not go back to China for 30 years.
Why is that?
Because in 1949, the communists took over the country. And there was really no communication with the United States and China. The students could not go back unless they wanted to become part of the communist country. So my mother always talked about China from a very nostalgic point of view, what they lost, how she could never see her mother. And I think the emotional trauma of that I didn't really recognize until very recently. My father was much more stoic. He never talked about his parents, but my mother talked about her parents quite a bit.
What year was your father born?
He was born in 1916.
It was really a difficult time, a lot of war.
Yes, China has a history of instability politically, wars, famine, natural disaster, etc. And so I think my parents, obviously, decided to stay in America and see what they could do in America.
How much do you know why your parents came to America and when was that?
In 1937. My mother came to America first when she was age 17. As a high school student, she graduated first in her class from a Catholic school taught by international nuns. She was offered a scholarship to an American college.
Wow,
And that was in Ohio, Toledo, Ohio. It was called Marymount's College.
very nice.
In 1937, that was the year the Japanese formally invaded Manchuria.
Right.
And I think my grandfather probably had an inkling that things were not going to be great
Where was he then?
in Qingdao. And he said to my mother, yes, you can go to America and go to college, which is very unusual because, first of all, girls didn't get those opportunities. And then he designated my mother's sister, Aunt Jessie, to be her chaperone. The two of them made their way to Toledo, Ohio. They started in 37, graduated in 1941, and they both majored in music.
Wow, that's where you picked up the musical genes.
Yes.
How about your father? How much do you know when and why he came to America?
He came because he was sponsored by the China Petroleum Company. He was asked to review sources of fossil fuel. So he describes, for example, touring the country, Wyoming in particular, where there's a lot of gas fields, and learning about petroleum and gas and other aspects of that industry. But he always also said in Wyoming, he and his group were not welcome. They were not welcome by the restaurants. They were not welcome by the hotels because they were Chinese. And there had been a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in the West with the 1882 Exclusion Act and a lot of violence perpetrated against Chinese immigrants.
How would you describe what is the impetus that triggered both your dad and your mother to say, I got to go to America?
The push was learn from America, learn what there is to learn in life. And for my mother, it opened a totally new vista for education, musical training. And for my father, it meant learning from a fledgling industry in the United States, but certainly more developed than in China. For many people who immigrate to America is learn what you cannot learn in your own country and then perhaps take it back to your own country. For my father, 1962 to 1964, he went back and helped the China Petroleum Company build chemical plants in Taiwan.
When you describe the push, that is such a good way of pinpointing the internal incentive. We, as students of Chinese history, knew the uprising within China, as well as wars that were encroachment from the West and to Japan later on. Chinese people blamed themselves for being weak and maybe not as modern. So the obsession, isn't it, is to become modern and strong, right?
Yes.
So that is almost a national narrative, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that many people who come to America are influenced by pride in their country. How to make China less weak, how to make China strong. And we can still see that today.
You said when my parents came to the United States to study in the late 1940s, they were already fluent in English, but my husband, who came at age 7 to New York City, spoke no English. However, he learned quickly from Catholic school nuns in an environment that his mother said had the best discipline. So I was just curious, how important was the command of English to gain respect? For your husband, did he ever talk about that?
Speaking English gives you an immediate way to communicate with others. Many people in America have never had interactions with Chinese. So they're afraid that they cannot communicate with you. And that keeps them a little bit standoffish. But if you can communicate with them and let them know that you speak their language, you know their lingo, you may even have funny jokes to tell them, then all of a sudden they can become friends.
Yes.
When I was growing up, I was always taught by my teachers that it was very important to enunciate, to know English, to be able to read, etc., etc. And then I watched My Fair Lady, which was my favorite movie of all time.
Mine too.
My husband and his family came over in 1947, before the major part of China's Civil War started. His father had been fighting against the Japanese since the late 1930s. But when he came, his older sisters were 9 years and 7 years older. So they had a much more difficult time learning English. And Fred was very gregarious. So he learned English almost immediately from going to Catholic school. I must say that I used to think of missionaries and Christians in China as not belonging there. They came for their own reasons, which was to civilize the savages.
Yeah.
On the other hand, they contributed greatly to my grandfather's education because they plucked him out of a group of boys and taught him English. This led to his college education, both in English and Chinese.
Well, since you mentioned Fred, so Dr. Frederick Pei Li, tell me about him. I know that he passed some years ago, but tell us about why and when did he come?
They came as refugees. His family was a military family and a political family. Militarily, his father was the general of the 4th Iron Army, involved in the defense of southern China, Guangdong in particular, from the Japanese in the late 1930s. As the war continued on, he became a nationalist working under Jiang Jieshi. And he found Jiang Jieshi very corrupt. In 1947, rather than staying with the nationalists, he brought his family to America, ostensibly for medical reasons, because he had lost his hearing as a result of the guns, the bombardments.
Yes.
And somehow he was able to get the whole family out and to New York City. He went back to China to see whether there was anything he could contribute. But by that time, the chaos was amazing, and many of his colleagues had been either murdered or escaped, disappeared. So he finally made it back to America, and then they started to build a life in New York City.
Let's switch gear a bit and talk about the way you were raised by your parents. First of all, expectation.
Expectation starts very early. They expected us to learn. So their expectation was that we would do well.
You excel.
Yeah, we would excel. And I think partly because they had a college education. They were already of an educated class. Then you get to a teenager, to college. They never had any expectations that I would become A, B, or C. But my older sister, she got the brunt of any criticism that they could give somebody who didn't score very high on their PSATs or their SAT. Their criticism echoed down to me, and so I said to myself, I'm never going to be criticized like that. I'll just score higher.
You had your older sisters look at and then examine your own heart and say, what can you do better?
Exactly, but being number two is always a question of how do I try harder?
You have 3 grown children now. Of course, they were once very young and needed a lot of parenting. How much of that parenting style or expectations from your parents did you adopt and pass on to your 3 children, Andrew, Margaret, and Irene?
I was very aware of what a Chinese parent might say to his or her children. Get good grades, go to college, get into the Ivy League college, blah, blah, blah. I did not adopt that. I felt that put too much pressure on the kids. So I would say to them, I don't care if you don't get an A. I just want you to learn the material. By learning the material, you would get an A.
Wow.
Even in their professions. I said, oh, you want to go into the restaurant business? And I said to them, 90% of restaurants fail in the first year. Are you sure you're willing to take that risk?
You frame it so that you're asking them the question, have you thought this through?
Yes, I didn't say you can't do it. Although in my mind, I was saying they're crazy.
You're so smart with your parenting style. I'm serious.
Well, I said to them, look, if you really want to do this, why don't you do the research and find out what the difficulties are and why people fail. And after you've done that, if you still want to go forward, then I will support you.
Right.
So I gave them a way to back out if they wanted to back out, to go forward if they wanted to go forward. And that's the way I have used my parenting style, is to ask them to make the decisions.
I will interview your famous chef daughter a little bit later on, Irene Lee, the famous James Beard Leadership Award winner. So that will come up next. But let's focus on her since she's going to be on our show. You had told me you wanted to raise her very differently from the first two children. And you said you were perhaps tougher, more hands on with her when it comes to learning the Chinese language. And you wanted her to have culture be a forethought and not an afterthought. Tell me more about that.
Irene is our third child. She is 8 years younger than my second child. For my first two children, I might have been a little bit on the liberal side because my son has said, "Gee, Mom, I wish you had pushed me harder."
Ah, interesting.
You know, we were around the dinner table and somehow college came up and he said, "Oh, I'd like to go to California." And my older daughter said, "I'd like just to go somewhere famous, as far as away from you as I can get." So they already had ideas. And for Irene, I decided there were a number of things that I would do differently. I would make her study Chinese formally. So it was only a Saturday for 3 years. And one day she came home from Chinese school and she said, "Mom, I have finally figured out I am the third and a half generation Chinese."
Oh,
Because she figured out that so many of her classmates in Chinese school had parents who spoke in Chinese, therefore they were very good in Chinese. Then I thought, okay, let's take her to China. So at age 6, at age 7, I took her to China so she would be exposed to China. And at age 10, I took her out of school because I told her, "Irene, you are growing up in Brookline, it's very wonderful, quote, liberal, parentheses, liberal city, but you have not seen the world." And based on my experience of living in Taiwan and being exposed to more than just a liberal
progressive
Eastern
environment.
city, yeah, I took her to China and we stayed there for 3 months and I made her learn Chinese.
How did she react?
Absoluted, hated it.
How did she show it?
Well, we would be on a bus and she would be reading a book in English and people would crowd around her wondering, what is this kid doing? And then she would say things like, "Mom, what is wrong with this country? Why don't people speak English?"
Absolutely. You know, the world must revolve around Americans.
Yes.
American English.
Especially a girl aged 10.
What year would that have been?
That would have been the year 2000. And I left her in the care of my 72-year-old cousin, who took her around Beijing and showed her all the parts of Beijing, but she had to speak Chinese. Otherwise, she couldn't communicate. It wasn't great. It was very difficult for her.
Did she not fuss?
She developed all sorts of tics, burping, hiccups, grinding your teeth, stomach aches, etc., etc. Of course, my being a doctor, I didn't see any of that, stupidly unclinical when it comes to your children. But I did take her on fall vacation once. We went to a hotel and I took her up to the 7th floor roof and I said, "Irene, you can scream as much as you want."
You give her an outlet. You give her a chance to let it out, but then you still got to learn. How did you convince her? Did you try to convince her the importance of her Chinese roots and therefore language?
I didn't try to convince her. I just showed her. If you're in a country where you do not speak the language, but you know that you are Chinese, maybe you have to figure out you've got to learn. And that's part of what I learned. So I took Chinese school when I was age 6, 7. Then we lived in Taiwan when I was 12 to 14. We had to take Chinese language classes. I took Chinese when I was in college.
I have to give your daughter, Irene, a lot of credit. 6 and 7, going to China to visit and then learning at 10. She obeys, she listens. There are so many kids. They would just wail and flail.
Well, we never had that in my family. We had no wailing and flailing. We had whining and dining. WHINING. And whining was not allowed in my family. If they didn't like something, they could tell me why, but they couldn't whine. So I had strict behavioral criteria. I always used to say to them, "Yes, I am medieval compared to you. But if you understand that, then you will always respect me and you will never embarrass me."
So they were rebelling.
Well, it's not necessarily rebelling, but they were acting as teenagers do.
Right, exactly. And also the environment. We're in America.
Yes.
You know, you look around and see what is acceptable.
Yes.
What's allowed.
Yes.
And then they push it.
They push it because that's part of growing up.
Yes.
These aberrant, quote, behaviors, because they're not doing it just to make me feel bad. They're taking a lot of cues from their peers and doing things that make them get into trouble.
Right. I want to come back at this because I wanted to get an answer that I'm not sure I heard it. But why do you emphasize that our Chinese culture needs to be a forethought and not an afterthought? What's wrong with an afterthought? She's in America. She's American.
Well, that's a very complicated answer. Yes, when you're in America, people expect you to be American, talk American, eat American, although there are a lot of people who don't take that fully. When you're an Asian American, people often look at you and say you're Asian.
Right, because that's what we look like. We are Asian.
You cannot get away from that.
Right.
Just as if you're African American, you cannot get away from that. So that creates a lot of stereotypes. And I figured, as long as you're Asian American, embrace it.
Right.
Don't try to deny it, because it's going to be around you all your life. When you're an adolescent and you're trying to figure out who are you, where are you going, and where you first need to know in part where are you from, because how has your ancestry shaped you? And if you are willing to acknowledge that your ancestry has molded you to a certain degree, then you can go with it rather than just run away with it.
What do you most want to pass on to your children and the many generations that follow? Is it your sense of purpose? Is it rooted in a particular religion, a faith, or a spiritual practice?
Well, this is a very interesting question, because when I was young, I came from a middle-class family. I went into medicine is because I knew I'd have a job. And I never wanted to be poor. We had 5 children in my family. My mother gave us a wonderful exposure to lots of different things. I've focused on financial well-being for my children. I want them to think about other things to do rather than just make money for themselves. That's in part where my father's compassion comes in. And my mother, because she came from a family that was wealthy, but she lost it all during the Communist Revolution, she was always concerned about money. Now, is this spiritual? Yes, in some ways it's spiritual, because it's thinking of how to make yourself whole. It does not follow religion, though, because even though I was baptized as a Christian, I always gave my children the option.
So what you most want to pass on to your children is the idea of wealth building to share, to help others in need.
Yes, but it's not only wealth building, it's building yourself so that your attributes, your advantages can help the world, because the world needs help. And they're in a position, some of them are in a potential position to do that. And I think their interest in food is actually a way to do that.
I want to close this interview by asking you, how do you see your Chinese roots or American roots coming out more so at this stage in your life?
What a great question. In the last 5 years since I've been retired, I have been more involved in the Boston Chinatown community. And I've been involved in the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, the Powell Arts Center, and a lot of theater that is created by Asian American artists. But I was involved in Chinatown when I was a teenager. My parents went to the Boston Chinese Christian Church of New England. And so right now I'm doing more things Chinese, and it's so funny because I'm teaching my children and a lot of their friends and my friends how to play mahjong.
Whoa, can you play
yes,
with
of
me?
Course, of course. But the key to that is that we speak Chinese.
Wow.
And they have said, oh, I've got to learn Chinese. So it's an indirect way of bringing the culture into their life and my life again.
I can't believe how eager I was to play mahjong. That's how my roots are coming out now at this stage of my life. Well, you see, I learned mahjong from my mother as a teenager, and I used to win quite a bit. but I stopped playing since I left Hong Kong, my hometown, to come to America for a better education. And listening to Elaine talk about her father, who believed in girls, which was also something very progressive for a Chinese family at that time. Well, my father, too, as a traditional man, also believed in girls. Before he let me come to America, he made me promise him 3 things. Number 1, I can't make him lose face. I can do whatever I want, just can't embarrass him. Number 2, I must know how to do math. That means I must know how to calculate and evaluate things, cost and benefit. Number 3, I can't marry an American. Well, almost 10 years ago, my dad met my husband. He wasn't so sure about him until my husband opened his mouth and spoke Chinese. He's an American, and my dad was happy. Elaine, thank you for your incredible story, so well told. Here's your daughter Irene's story up next.
My dad's family is from Guangdong, and my mom's family is from Qingdao. And I've gotten to visit both of those places. It's so interesting to go to where your roots are and to be a foreigner. So that has been a cool and thought-provoking experience for me.
That's Irene Lee, a James Beard Leadership Award winner and food entrepreneur in Boston. What's her struggle trying to find her roots, her own path, and her individuality? Tune in to our next episode, the last Tuesday of May. 1 in a Billion Find Your Roots special series is made possible in part by a generous grant from the Phi Lambda Charitable Trust. 1 in a Billion is produced by our sound engineer and designer Brian Latinowicz, and our lovely theme song is composed by Brad McCarthy. Let us know if you want to join our team of volunteers, help us plan events, or pitch a story. Just go to our website, oneinaBillionVoices.org, and find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.